Good morning, Metalheads Internet. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we are looking at the debut solo album from David Ellefson entitled Sleeping Giants. While it is released under the name Ellefson, as I said, this is the debut solo album from Mr. David Ellefson, a founding member and longtime bassist for American thrash metal legends Megadeth. Now, mind you, David has done plenty of stuff on the side throughout the years. He's contributed to albums from Soulfly and Tim Owens and Geoff Tate. He's been a part of Metal Allegiance. He has a project right now with Frank Bello of Megadeth entitled Altitudes and Attitudes. They're more of a contemporary hard rock kind of vibe. And in the mid-2000s, he had his own band as well entitled F5, which featured drummer Jimmy DeGrasso. You know, he also played with Megadeth and also played with Suicidal Tendencies, David Lee Roth, Black Star Riders. But this is still his first official solo album, and it also acts as a companion piece to his recent memoir, More Life with Death. It is admittedly an odd choice releasing an album as a companion piece to a book, but it's not unheard of. Nikki Sixx has done this multiple times through a project called 6 a.m., most famously with the Heroin Diaries project, which birthed not only a really interesting collection of memoirs, but also a surprisingly really well thought out concept album that detailed Nikki Sixx's drug abuse and his life in the 1980s. And if I may say right off the bat, it is already a bit of a missed opportunity for Ellefson not to try and do something similar with Sleeping Giants. It would have been a great opportunity for him to establish himself and distinguish himself from his other projects, and to make Sleeping Giants feel like a more unique and personal affair. It also, frankly, would have just made more sense considering the timing of the book and the album release. You know, it is an opportunity there to create something really unique, and it wasn't taken. But, to be fair, this doesn't need to be a concept album to succeed. It just needs to have some cool hard rock and some cool heavy metal tunes. Which is why it's sad to say that it also doesn't have that going for it either. Sleeping Giants isn't just a lackluster affair, it's also a very confusing one. There's a lot of odd choices throughout the entire album. For instance, there's not a lot to talk about in the vein of songwriting, because Ellefson doesn't do a lot of songwriting. He kind of steps to the side and just plays his bass, and if anything, he lets the special guests on each of his songs kind of determine the style of that song. He lets them take full control, despite this being a project called Ellefson, a project named after him. He's supposed to be the main guy here, isn't he? For example, when Chris Poland shows up, it just kind of turns into a Megadeth song, a very weak, lackluster Megadeth song that frankly would have been cut even off of one of Megadeth's worst records. Contrastly, when David Glenn Eisley shows up, this thing turns into 80s contemporary hard rock, very much in the vein of Giuffra and David Glenn Eisley's infamous Sweet Victory, but with none of the enthusiasm and energy to back it up. And when John Bush shows up, it just turns into the same kind of thing that we would have heard from early and mid-90s Anthrax. It's just not really that special, and it's very predictable, and there's nothing here that establishes Ellefson as a really great songwriter or performer. In fact, even his bass work in all of these tracks is kind of blacked out by everything else going on, which is normal for heavy metal, but not normal for the band that Ellefson is a part of, and especially not normal when he is the main performer. This is his band. And there's just a lot of other puzzling decisions. For instance, some of these songs have a vocalist named Thom Hazaert. I've never heard of this guy before. I have no idea if he's performed with other bands, but he just fucking blows, man. He sounds terrible. He constantly sounds like he's trying to do an imitation of Lemmy Kilmister, Dave Mustaine, and Phil Anselmo all at once. He's just gruffly barking into the microphone, quite literally screaming with a rasp at times. Even in his best moments on this record, he is insanely irritating and shows absolutely no technical skill for singing whatsoever. He has trouble carrying the most basic hard rock hook. And it only gets more obvious when other vocalists start to show up, and they show you just how fucking bad Thom is. For instance, on the second track and title track of the record, Sleeping Giants, Daryl DMC of Run DMC makes an appearance. Not sure why, but what the fuck ever. Obviously, with him coming from a background in hip-hop, he's not a fucking singer. And yet he outperforms the fuck out of Thom. He brings way more character. His performance immediately doesn't mesh with the aggressive kind of semi-thrash metal that Ellefson is putting out, and yet he is still significantly way better than Thom on here. And what makes it all the worse is the flow throughout the entire album. I mean, what we really have here, to be fully honest, isn't even a studio album. We have two completely different EPs and a collection of demos that have been sandwiched together into one little fucking mess and painted to look like an original studio album. You have the first EP, which is basically Diet Megadeth with a boatload of guest stars who dictate what's going to happen next, while Ellefson fiddles with his bass in the background. You have a second EP where David Glenn Eisley takes the forefront of the sound and turns this into 80s contemporary hard rock on the level of AOR. And then you have, literally in the middle of this whole thing, a collection of demos left over from Ellefson's aforementioned F5. And obviously they're all mixed way differently. Obviously they're all performed way fucking differently. And it just highlights how confusing and messy this whole thing is. May I add, those F5 demos? Not really that interesting. Not really out of line with anything that we would have heard from early, late 2000s heavy metal and contemporary radio rock. It's just really angsty and bland, and sure, there are some thrash metal flavors thrown into the mix, but nothing substantial, nothing that's really going to get you particularly excited unless you really fucking love F5. And who knows, maybe you do love F5, but I have to assume that since you clicked on this video, that you know of Ellefson primarily through Megadeth, and therefore you are probably expecting something more in line with that. And therefore, you'd probably be upset by these few tracks that are essentially Diet Megadeth songs that are underwritten and underperformed and dictated by a bunch of guest stars, while Ellefson pretty much does nothing and is drowned out by the chaos. Honestly, on a certain level, this isn't much better than Megadeth's 13 or their infamous Super Collider. I mean, I guess in some ways it's probably a more interesting record, but it's definitely as incoherently written and incompetently arranged. So I'm going to give this thing a 1.5 out of 5. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone who wasn't a diehard Megadeth fan, and frankly, if you are a diehard Megadeth fan, you would just have more fun listening to Megadeth. For fuck's sakes, Megadeth put out a massive anthology set earlier this year called Warheads on Foreheads, and all the tracks are remastered, and it's got all their biggest hits, and I would happily listen to that 10 times over than ever listening to Sleeping Giants ever again. It's not like the people involved don't care. There are some cool performances that can be found from some of the guitarists. It is inherently cool to see Chris Poland back playing Megadeth-style music, but unfortunately it doesn't amount to anything. The record doesn't have a goal. It seems to flop back and forth between all these styles and all these phases and all these periods, and not one bit of it is consistently mixed or performed. In its best moments, this is a record that maybe you could throw on for your fucking dad who complains about how, like, music isn't good anymore, but that's about it. But also, just like those Megadeth diehard fans, you could probably just play, you know, actual fucking rock and roll for your dad, something far more inspired and original. Maybe this was inevitable. I mean, we've never really known Ellefson as a songwriter per se, but he is an accomplished musician who has worked with some of the biggest names in hard rock and heavy metal. I mean, for fuck's sakes, the guy's a Grammy winner. So I would think that eventually he would pick up on something. I would think that through the course of time he would understand how an album is laid out and how an album should be presented to people. But yeah, I guess that's not the case, and ultimately Sleeping Giants is bland, unseasoned, forgettable, incompetently arranged, and only exists so that Dave Ellefson can sell a book while also cleaning out his closet. If I were you, I would not waste my time with this whatsoever. 1.5 out of 5. It's a bad record. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.